Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. When we look at the ancient structures of Peru and Bolivia, we can all take note of the ruinous state of what were some prime examples of amazing ancient architecture. Some incredible things do remain, like the amazing polygonal megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman, the amazing Piedra Cansada or Chinkana Grande, the polygonal walls on the streets of Cuzco, as well as some of the masonry of the Coricancha. Since the site was cleared, Machu Picchu is also better preserved than many other Peruvian sites. I stated in my last video that a lot of the damage is modern, inflicted in the past 500 years, not some kind of ancient natural catastrophe, but destruction created by humans to remove vestiges of the indigenous Andean cultures. As well as the destruction during and after the Spanish conquest, we know that parts of Sacsayhuaman were destroyed by dynamite blasts in the early 20th century, when parts of the site became a quarry, and also because authorities wanted the underground tunnels blocked, to stop treasure hunters and tourists exploring them. They were also potentially dangerous. As stated in my previous video, I believe the importance of Sacsayhuaman was water. It's the key to understanding the site, with numerous channels, basins, wells and reservoirs that were built because of an abundance of natural springs that emanated from the limestone bedrock, outcrops that were carved into the famous sacred huacas. I believe the majority of the damage we see on these ancient sacred huacas around Coricancha is from modern dynamite. It looks too localised on specific limestone outcrops to be some kind of large-scale catastrophe. If there was a natural disaster that can blow up and flip huge boulders of limestone, then the polygonal masonry walls that are close by would have been obliterated. Some say this can be explained by the huge carved boulders being much older than anything else on site, and so they could have been subject to some ancient catastrophe in days gone by. But because we can see a huge chunk of carved huaca actually leaning on a polygonal wall, it is clear evidence the destruction came after the walls were constructed, and also that it was localised, likely from dynamite, specifically placed to destroy what would have been a large limestone outcrop, destroyed to remove traces of the ancient cultures, and also for quarrying. With this in mind, I went hunting for descriptions and sketches of Sacsayhuaman before the 20th century. Because, as well as trying to find out what certain parts of the site were like before the damage, we might also find more evidence for now lost water-related structures as well. Apart from the famous Spanish chronicles, which are not always credible because of the politics of the day, finding such descriptions was not an easy task. Thankfully, I came across the work of Francis Comte de Castelnau, apologies if I butchered that name, who travelled across South America in the 1840s. In the collection of works, he includes descriptions and sketches of architecture, carved natural rock formations and archaeological finds like figurines and pottery, some pictures in colour and some in black and white. We don't get pages and pages of detail, but he does give a good overview. But I'll pick out some key points and also show you the amazing sketches from his books, because we do learn something. I have to say, I love reading these old descriptions of sites before they were cleared, preserved and turned into tourist destinations. They really have that mysterious Indiana Jones feel to them, and the one from Castelnau really paints a beautiful picture. He says, to get there you follow a narrow path that runs through a deep ravine without deviating from a rushing torrent, which forms numerous waterfalls next to the traveller. I translated this from French on Google Translate, so I don't know if anything is slightly off, but he's already showing us how wet this environment was around 170 years ago. People have said in the comments of my last video that, in their opinion, I'm wrong about my Sacsayhuaman water interpretation, and that these structures are nothing to do with water, because in this specific landscape, you wouldn't get the volume needed to fill the reservoir. Well, the water table could have been much higher hundreds of years ago, and as Castelnau explains, in the 1840s the flow of water clearly had a very high energy on your way up to the fortress. He then says, This path presents a very rapid climb and leads to the Great Gate of the fortress. There is the first rampart, which is 1.5 metres in width and 5 metres in height, in the state of degradation in which it stands today. The portion which extends to the right, and which completes the work on this side, is flanked by an enormous rock nearly 7 metres long. Here we can see a sketch of the gateway, and thanks to the Twitter user named Axtrax, they helped me locate it on the ground. It's right here facing the valley, so I can only assume that this is the way that Castelnau went up to the site from Cuzco, and where a torrent of water was rushing down, and where he saw the waterfalls. It shows that, in the 1840s, this site was still extremely wet. When I changed the perspective on Google Maps, I could see that the site of Coricancha is a shallow hill and also a similar elevation to Sacsayhuaman hill. From the Coca and travelling north, the ground gets steeper quite fast, almost as if Coricancha is actually at the bottom of a hill. Topographically speaking, it really is no surprise there are springs around the Coca. Groundwater would be flowing down towards Cuzco from the north, and due to the ancient Rodadero igneous extrusion, the limestone around Coricancha likely contains much deformity, fissures, faults, mineralisation zones and so on. In this region I don't know what the underlying bedding planes look like, but what I do know is that there is no reason to doubt that this region could have been rich in natural springs. Back to Castelnau's report, and he next describes Sacsayhuaman as we know it. There really isn't a lot to say that you don't already know, although he does remark there is a well on the Sacsayhuaman hill, but the exact location is not given. He next describes the area to the north, where we find the Rodadero formation as well as the Coca reservoir. He states the name of the hill is Piedra Cansada, and how the Inca used to slide down the igneous extrusion, something that still continues today. He next goes on to describe the mass of stone on the northern margins of Coricancha. In my last video, I said that I would guess that this site would have had a natural spring, and probably the main spring that fed the Coca. But I couldn't really say anything more, as I couldn't find any specific information about it. He names this mass of bedrock and boulders the Rodadero, stating it was some kind of quarry where blocks were cut on the spot. I can understand this interpretation based on how it looks, but that's probably because he didn't know about sacred huacas and how the ancient Peruvian people shaped the living stone. He says, many of them do not seem to have been completed. Several have the shape of seats, and their outlines are extremely pure. He includes this sketch of limestone, which shows a throne-like seat that is cut into the bedrock. It's thanks to Twitter user The Plastolithic Past, who identified the site in the sketch after trawling through the incredible image bank of the Arcana Factor website, which I've linked below in the description. Comparing the two images, and although some artistic license may have gone into the sketch, there certainly looks to be a lot more damage today compared to the 1840s. Still inside this limestone formation, Castelnau next states, in the middle of this rubble we discover 2 or 3 wells which were filled up with stones. This was great to find because it shows that this outcrop was also once associated with water. He sketches one of the wells, and although crude, it does seem to be lined with the watertight polygonal masonry. So, following on from my last video, and we have yet more water-related features in the region of the huge sacred limestone huacas that surround the reservoir, and more evidence that polygonal masonry was used to line features that contained water. Castelnau next travels to Piedra Cansada or Chinkana Grande. He calls the rock Peter of the Stairs, which is I think the 4th different name I've found for this site. He explains its fantastic appearance, that it's covered with steps and very beautifully crafted seats. He explains that the interior of the block does seem to have been worked, because an earthquake has detached a large portion. This crack in the rock detached a staircase. He supplies 3 sketches of this rock as it appeared in the 1840s, and this one shows the detached staircase in quite some detail. Interestingly, as shown in a video by Brian Forster, which I've linked below, the detached block is even more destroyed today, and a huge portion is even upside down. So, since the 1840s, we do see considerable more damage to the site, again likely from dynamite in the 1920s. Castelnau backs up my strong belief that this site is also associated with water, as he says there is also an entrance to a well right next to the stone. He then recounts the legend that you can enter a labyrinth of tunnels from the stone, and you can even reach the ancient Coricancha in Cuzco. The book goes on to discuss other Inca sites, as well as Inca palaces in the city of Cuzco, and I've left a link in the description below so you can read and translate the original French text. I've also left a link to the sketches, which are all included in a separate book by the same author, all available on archive.org. The Russian scientists who investigated Sacsayhuaman on behalf of Peruvian authorities in July 2012 confirmed Castelnau's claims of a tunnel and passages below Chinkana Grande. They conducted a geophysical survey and noted clear readings of a tunnel, 2.5 metres below ground, which was 1.5 metres wide and 2 metres high. This tunnel points directly towards the Cocachincanas reservoir, and it is likely to be a water channel, whether natural, man-made or a bit of both. The more I look into the idea that Sacsayhuaman was a site of water management, the more it does seem to work. In the 1840s, the approach to Sacsayhuaman from Cuzco was extremely wet. In this chunk of limestone bedrock, there are 2 to 3 wells that are lined with polygonal stonework, and there was also another well at Chinkana Grande, and Geophysics shows a tunnel or channel does head for the reservoir, and that's on top of everything presented in my last video. Of course, nothing is clear-cut due to the nature of the site today, and there are still a number of ways to interpret the stonework of Sacsayhuaman. Everything, including the carved wackers, the polygonal and more primitive masonry, could all be part of one construction project. Different rocks for different purposes and all made by one culture, and not 3 styles of stonework by 3 different cultures over a long period of time. But we also know that springs arose from limestone outcrops, and that masonry channels and stone basins were built onto and around them. The carved wackers of Sacsayhuaman could therefore be the oldest feature of this landscape, but because the cuts were all made on the upper surfaces, unless the rock was blasted with dynamite in recent history, and the fact they still look so fresh, well, because it's limestone, I don't think they're extremely ancient. On this occasion, the mainstream timeline does seem to fit the evidence. The earliest pottery at this site is decay, which is a term that describes the Proto-Inca period of Cuzco, roughly between 1000 and 1400 AD. This could be when the wackers at Sacsayhuaman were carved, to mark and commemorate the natural springs. Spanish chroniclers state that the bulk of the stonework at Sacsayhuaman actually began during the reign of Inca Pachacuti, which was between 1418 and 1472 AD. But if Sacsayhuaman was primarily a site of water management for Cuzco and surrounding land, I believe that Sacsayhuaman was more like a continuous project, a work in progress from the Decay or Proto-Inca period all the way through to the Spanish conquest. This would make it an evolving 300 to 400 year project. It probably began to simply exploit the abundance of fresh water in the region, developing into a larger project to manage and channel this water, mainly for agricultural purposes and also to channel water to the city. Important construction work to support the rise of the empire. Of course, there would have been major construction spikes, and I do believe the fortress walls and religious buildings of Sacsayhuaman Hill were likely the final stage. And this could be the work of Inca Pachacuti, and continued by his successors Topa Inca and Huayna Capac, just as the Spanish chronicles state. Even though, as stated, the reliability of the Spanish chronicles has been called into question. Across the site we do see different types of stonework. We see the polygonal masonry that was seemingly used to create watertight sealed wells, walls and basins, whilst the more primitive masonry looks to have been used when they didn't need such properties. This masonry looks more primitive than the polygonal, but it doesn't have to imply it was made by more primitive people. It just shows that these people were efficient and used the right masonry for the right job. But many people have pointed out that we do often see more primitive stonework on top of polygonal masonry. But again, this doesn't have to imply the work of two cultures. It could simply imply that these walls were finished hastily, which could be explained by the fact the Inca were about to have a fierce battle with the Spanish army. There is also undeniable evidence the polygonal walls of the so-called fortress were also not finished, and Jean-Pierre Protson's paper from the late 1980s explains this in great detail, and I'll do an entire video on this paper soon. Maybe the painstaking work of fitting blocks into the walls of the fortress simply stopped because of an impending battle. Or maybe it stopped for another reason. A new ruler who wanted to redeploy people and resources to a new project. We simply don't know. Yes, it could imply the work of two different cultures, but this is just one interpretation of many. In the comments section of my last video, many people were asking where exactly the water has gone. Why isn't this region wet today? Why isn't Coricancha still full of water? And yes, they are all good questions and do need addressing. So, to end this video, let's take a look. According to the US Geological Survey, a spring is a place where water moving underground finds an opening to the land surface and emerges. Sometimes as just a trickle, maybe only after rain, and sometimes in a continuous flow. Spring water could also emerge from heated rock underground, giving rise to hot springs. But springs do dry up, and there are many reasons why this could happen. Firstly, the changing climate can dry up natural springs, there can be lower annual rainfall, and of course there are also droughts. And whilst I don't have historical data for Peru, the climate has affected natural springs around the world. But even if the amount of rainfall has been consistent, springs can also relocate, again for multiple reasons. One is an earthquake, and we know that Peru, the Andes and the entire western side of South America is subject to earthquakes, due to the plate boundary with the Pacific Ocean being a subduction zone, a place where the oceanic plate is thrust beneath South America. During a time of seismic activity, bedrock can move and deform. A slight tilt or uplift can instantly alter the natural flow of the groundwater. Groundwater will always follow the easiest path to the surface, through natural bedrock fissures, pores, fault zones and so on. If seismic activity affected Peru in the past 1000 or 500 years, then springs could certainly have been relocated. It's important to note that scientists who surveyed Sacsayhuaman in 2012 noted that relatively new subsurface fissures had appeared below the walls of the fortress, fissures that were damaging the megalithic polygonal walls. This is therefore hard geological evidence that the bedrock of the region has undergone destructive changes since Sacsayhuaman was built. On top of all this, there is human activity to factor in as well. The Spanish invaders could have dug new wells for water, draining the groundwater in certain other places in the system, and such a system is complex and extensive. Furthermore, new quarrying and explosive behaviour could have created new routes for groundwater flow. Geology and hydrology are both dynamic sciences, and in an area like the Andes that is seismically active, that has been subject to a lot of destruction in the past 500 years or so, it's not surprising that groundwater flow has changed and natural springs have likely relocated. In my next video on this subject, I'll be discussing the claims that the large megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman were actually unfinished, a fascinating subject that may explain the abrupt change of masonry we see at the site. Was this the work of two different cultures, or are we looking at one culture trying to finish the walls as quickly as possible, maybe because of a looming war to take control of Peru? All this and more in my next video on the subject. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.